Yep.
Welcome everybody to Science Division Live. My name is Jose Zuniga. I am one of the science educators of the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And it is my distinct pleasure right now to introduce you to our expert today, Carlton Shield Chief Gover. He is going to be sharing some awesome Pawnee collections with us from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Carlton.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be here with all of you. My name is Carlton Shield Chief Gover. I am a citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma. So I figured I'd share some things with you today that are Pawnee here at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science and the Anthropology collections, as well as give you some translations of some of these things in our language. So today we'll start off with some Pawnee bow and arrow equipment. And so the first thing coming right up, we have this 19th century bow. The Pawnee word for bow is tirakis. Now, depending on what kind of bow, so this one isn't made out of Osage orange. An Osage orange bow would be tirapahat, and a bow made out of horn would be tirakisu. And so we have these different words for different kinds of bows. This one here, you can see, is sinew-backed. So this is a way of making the bow more durable, and it will bend under greater pressure to give it greater strength. And we see bows here in the Americas. It's believed to be, if you go by Dale Walday in his 2013 article, he talks about there being 4 waves of bows and arrows that come to the New World. One around 12,000 years ago, another wave 4,500 years ago, the third wave 2,400 years ago, and lastly 1,300 years ago. And that's when they kind of stay. Now we see here in the Americas that bows are used for a very long time with the atlatl and dart system. And that kind of goes away around, 1,500 years ago. But you can even see it in Sparoan, Cahokian, and Mesoamerican imagery that you'll see bow iconography alongside atlatl and dart. Now, of course, what comes along with bows? Arrows. So we have a decent collection of arrows here at DM&S. A lot of these are historic. And can you tell they're historic? Well, the points on them are all made out of metal. And you really only see metal points during the contact period or the colonization period, in which scrap metal and hoop metal is being traded to American Indian groups and nations across the North and South America, and they're making arrowheads out of them. And the Pawnee word for arrow itself is riksu, and the Pawnee word for arrowhead is tahuru. So we have all these tahurus and we have all these riksu present. And you can see on the fletching, most of these arrows are fletched with turkey feathers. Now you also see arrows being fletched with eagle feathers and hawk feathers, but really you're going to see turkey feathers, specifically wing feathers from turkeys are used, whereas tail feathers from turkeys are actually used for atlatl darts. And we do have a couple of stone arrowheads here. These two guys right here, and these are ubiquitous plains side-notched arrowheads. And why are they side-notched? Well, if you can see right here on the side, there's a notch. So those are side-notched. Now they'd be corner-notched if they were notched right here on the corner. And the style of fletching of Pawnee arrows, you can see they're tied in the front and tied in the back. So you don't see, like in other arrows, how you have sinew wrapping in a diagonal pattern across. No, they would cut off the feathers up on the front here, and they'd sew that on the front and the back. And you can see in the back where a lot of these arrows get notched into the bowstring. So this is a really cool collection of arrowheads that DM&S has. Now, what do you put your arrows in? What do you put your bow in? Well, of course, we'll go around here and we have a Pawnee quiver and bow case. Now, these ones are made out of leather. This is also a historic 19th century, but you also wouldn't be uncommon to find bow cases and quivers to be made out of otter skin. And why would they use otter? Well, what you could do is if you took a whole otter, you skinned it, fleshed it out, and you sewed, like you'd sew the bottom of the base of this quiver here, you sew it, the otter's mouth shut, you leave the tail on, and you put a little cog at the end of it. And otters are naturally waterproof. So you have a waterproof bow case and quiver. So you'd see a lot of otter and sometimes beaver being used with the fur on as the quiver and bow case. The Pawnee word for quiver is nawachu. And so we have a nawachu right here. And, you know, these bows and arrows, even in the historic times, even when Pawnees and other Central Plains indigenous groups had guns, the bow and arrow system, along with horses, it's one weapon system. Bows, arrows, horses. That is one hunting system, one weapon system. They preferred bows and arrows for bison hunting. You reserved the guns for war and battle. But Pawnees still preferred to use bows and arrows for hunting bison well into the late 19th century. So these are a couple cool objects that we have here that are Pawnee at Denver Museum of Nature and Science. Now, kind of moving away from some of this hunting system, we also have a Pawnee drum present. This drum you can see decorated, and it has the motif of the thunderbird. And the thunderbird is pretty common in indigenous mythology. It brings the rain. Many of you might be familiar with it from Harry Potter's Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, the first one. That was kind of the premise of that. But we see that here, as well as some geometric designs and a small drum handle here. So this is a pretty small drum, so a single person drum. We also have a beaded necklace. This is a pretty homogeneous kind of style, so some zigzags. You see a lot of these actually pretty interestingly, which we could talk about in archaeology. In Pawnee pots, the rim, so the top of the pot, has these same kind of designs generally, these cross zigzag designs, crotch hats designs. And in the period that we like to call the Central Plains tradition, which is about 950 AD to 1450 AD, the only kind of Pawnee pots, the only way they're decorated is on the rim with these same designs. And of course, it's hard to see necklaces and forms of decoration in the past, but it's not hard to be able to tie some of these dichotomies between jewelry and pottery and them using the same designs. So that's another little cool piece that we have here, you know, leather strapped, European trade beads. And then lastly, this is extraordinarily fascinating. This is his regal son's headdress. Some people he's mainly known by Sun Chief. This is one of the prominent headdresses. Well, this is a headdress that belonged to one of our prominent chiefs in the late 19th century, his regal son or Sun Chief. The Pawnee are made up of basically the Pawnee Nation is made up of 4 other tribes. The Skeety, which is what I am, which is arguably the best of the bands that make up the Pawnee, Kitkahakis, Petahawidatas, and the Chowees. Now, his regal son was Chowee. He was the head Chowee chief. And then later he became the head chief of the entire Pawnee Nation. Now it says here on the label that he had it for about 50 years, but more than likely his regal son gave the headdress to his son, who also had the name Sun Chief. During the Dawes Act in the late 19th century and early 20th century, you know, indigenous people, including the Pawnees, didn't really have family names. We didn't have last names. So when the Dawes Act was coming around, they kind of stuck to a family name that was a prominent individual in their family. So Sun Chief, they just took the name Sun Chief as their family name in honor of their relative who is a leader in the tribe. Like my last name, Shield Chief, comes from one of my ancestors whose name was Shield Chief, and he was a Pawnee scout in the US Army during the Indian Wars. So this is made up of over 30 bald eagle feathers. But what I really like about this is you can see this blue cloth here. Now you'll see a lot of indigenous garments, especially in the late 19th century, made out of this blue. And this is just typical US Army surplus blue. So a lot of blankets that were handed out, especially in the reservation systems, were these blue blankets. And what Pawnee people would do is use the blankets and turn them into leggings, into vests, or use them to make headdresses. So you can see the adoption of a lot of these American surplus goods being used into Pawnee regalia. The headdress itself has bison horns on the top. It's nicely beaded. It's being well taken care of here at DMNS. But I was absolutely blown away when I found out who this belonged to, because even today, his regal son is still a very prominent figure in Pawnee culture, and he's still envied by us, and we talk about him greatly. So to be able to see this in front of me is just absolutely fascinating. So not the largest of collections here, but still a pretty good amount of Pawnee materials here at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. So thank you so much, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Yes, if you have any questions for Carlton, feel free to post them in the comments. We will try to answer as many questions as we can. And I know it's very tough to think of questions off the top of your head. So Carlton, I have a few questions for you. You might be able to answer for me.
Absolutely.
Is there evidence, when we looked at the number of arrows that were present, you had talked about how metal was traded for, and that was used in arrowhead design, and then there were some stone arrowheads. What can we glean from these arrows that might suggest what they may have been like pre-Columbian contact? Were a lot of changes made to accommodate metal arrowheads, or were they made in a similar sort of way to what we think arrowheads might have been like before?
So that's a great question. I mean, they're primarily just beveled, so triangular points. They don't really have, like, you can see the design on, I can switch the camera. I mean, even just the size of them. If you look at, what did I have? What did I do there? There we go. Okay, zoom. So, I mean, even just the size of the stone points is what we call burr points. They're rather small, so like about the size of the tip of my pinky. And the length of the arrowheads that are made out of metal are much larger. And they're, most importantly, where they're hafted onto the foreshaft, they're not sharp. Whereas even the side notch here, that indent is sharp. So you actually see a lot of sinew being broken off, whereas on these metal points, it's not uncommon for not only these points to last longer because they're made out of metal, but they last longer on the arrow themselves. But the size of the arrows doesn't really change. Basically, they find making arrowheads, stone points, is extremely time consuming, and you have to go out and find a lot of material for it. And in central Nebraska, where the core of the Pawnee homeland is, there's not really good stone material. In fact, they come out to Wyoming through the Hartville uplift. So you usually find these really gorgeous orange points with black inclusions, or Smoky Hills in Kansas, where you get some really nice red Smoky Hill jasper. But the arrows don't really change. It's just they adopt these metal points. They stop making stone tools. And you see this basically with all metal equipment. Many Plains nations stop making ceramic bowls, jars, ladles, and they just full on adopt European metal pots.
That's interesting. It's sometimes difficult to think about how that colonization affected every layer and aspect of life. I think that that's a really interesting thing we don't often, I think about when it comes to the amount of change that the mere presence of Europeans caused in the Americas.
Yeah, and some changes, like, funny enough, Mandan and Hidatsas maintained making pottery because the old men said the metal pots made their food taste weird. So a very like human aspect, like we could all think of our grandparents, that one very antagonistic grandparent that doesn't like change. And we can see that even 200, 300 years ago, that these old men were sitting around who were complaining about the metal pots and making their kids and grandkids continue the ceramic traditions. So, a humanizing aspect to that whole piece about colonization.
Well, and also thank goodness for that. So we still
Right.
have those traditions. We have a question in the comments. Is there any intention or desire to display any of these collections in the museum?
That is out of my wheelhouse. I'm not sure. Maybe depending on if Crane Hall ever gets redone, it's a possibility. But as of now, I'm not aware of any intention to display any of these objects. And I imagine if they did, it'd be in collaboration with the Pawnee Nation government back in Pawnee, Oklahoma.
For those of you who are tuning in who may not know what we mean when we say Crane Hall, that's our North American Indian Cultures Hall in the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. The hall itself is called Crane Hall, so that's usually how we in the museum refer to it. I was thinking about, you had talked about how the quiver was made out of otter and that they would sew them up and leave the tail, and then it was waterproof. And as somebody who has never in my life been around animals in a significant sort of way, they've either been on the other side of the rail or the other side of the glass. It struck me as how sort of ingenious it is to take the natural qualities of this animal and apply it for a use that you have. Do we see this reflected in any other Pawnee artifacts, maybe that aren't in the collections?
Yeah, I mean, bison hide's another good example of using an animal during different times of its lifespan. So many plains groups that you think of, Pawnees themselves, we would, plains villagers, so we would grow corn, squash, these huge towns in Kansas and Nebraska along the rivers. But while in the summer and winter, while the crops were growing, or we were waiting for the fields to replenish, we'd go on bison hunts here in the Front Range. Now, bison hides in the winter are very tough and hard to make clothes out of. Those are your blanket bison. So you'd go in the wintertime, not only just for food, but those bison hides make excellent blankets, really great blankets to survive these Great Plains winters. Whereas the summertime bison, those are the hides you make clothes out of and teepees out of, because the hides are much thinner. Of course, when you're talking about fletching of arrows, different birds have different properties. Turkey is just easier to find, but you also see specifically like bald eagle wings in some arrows. But I'm trying to. Oh yeah, Pawnees are known as the wolves of the plains, and the reason being, while we were sneaking up on other tribes, we would wear wolf pelts, so you can sneak up on the prairie, and then the other tribes or even animals themselves would think that they're looking at wolves and not be as alarmed. So kind of using animals to our natural advantage in order to do some spying or kind of get a look at the landscape. And so we get this moniker as the wolves of the plains for that reason. And I'm trying to think, yeah.
And I can see a parallel. You talk about that hides in the winter are different than in the summer, and that you would do different uses with them. And then that, of course, made me think about your reference in the headdress to the use of Army surplus blankets to create all sorts of different functional pieces of gear. So I think, I don't want to make any sort of assumptions, but I'm seeing this connection between using resources in the best way that they can be used, not only with things in the natural environment, but things that they're trading for. I mean, like you say, the arrowheads and things like that.
Yeah.
What is one thing that these collections might be able to teach us about the nature of the process of transitioning from a traditional way of life to a reservation way of life?
Yeah, I mean, just the European goods, like we've hit that nail on the head a couple of times, that there are these cultural shifts. But more importantly, it's easy to tie this transition from into the reservation system to other shifts that happen in time. So another big one, it'd be a comparative kind of demonstration, like how did when horses were reintroduced to the Americas, bows got shorter because now they're being used on horseback. Or when we start adopt the earth lodges, which can hold up to, like 6 dozen people, how does that change property? So it's kind of like, I hate to isolate the change into the reservation system and then to the long walk to Oklahoma as this transformation in time that only happened once. Wherein if you use archaeology and oral traditions of indigenous people, you can see through time that there are these massive transitions, like the medieval global warming period in the 1300s, which devastated European fisheries, which was the catalyst for, Christopher Columbus actually traveling to the Americas. There was dire effects here in the Americas where there was huge crop shortages because maize needs a lot of water. And the Great Plains had a longer and more severe drought than what we see in the Dust Bowl. So there are these other different periods of stress and time that I think would be a great way to show the resilience of indigenous people. And you have the material record through archaeology to showcase that. So, these European goods are one way to demonstrate change at a different time in Pawnee history.
It is helpful to remember that the history of peoples are dynamic and changing, and there have been many influences over a long period of time.
Exactly.
That's a very helpful perspective. I appreciate that. And then I have a question for you. As a member of the Pawnee Nation, you had talked about the impact you had seeing the headdress here in the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. So my question for you right before we wrap up, our sort of final question will be, what is your hope for these objects moving forward? What would you like to see happen to these objects? Would you like them to be displayed?
Yeah. Well, I would like to see more Pawnee citizens or indigenous individuals have access just to see them, right? This is part of our material history. That's especially for our nation. We were removed from Nebraska to Oklahoma, so we don't even have our ancestral territory. But these items that are not just here at DMNS, but elsewhere, are a physical reminder of our history that even just being able to see on with my own eyes is meaningful. And I want to give that same kind of experience to other Pawnees, especially some are young or younger or young ones. Hopefully, the Pawnee Nation is working on its own cultural center to have a state-of-the-art repository, and maybe it'd be a collaboration with DMNS to get these on loan and make a joint exhibit that could travel between DMNS and Pawnee, as well as maybe the State Historic Museum in Nebraska, to show that continuity and collaboration between different organizations and indigenous peoples.
Well, I hope that happens as well. I sincerely do. Thank you so much for joining us today, Carlton, and showing us these incredible things in our collection, and also sharing with us your own personal experiences. I've really thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope all of you folks out there have enjoyed it as well. Thanks again, Carlton. Thanks for joining us for Science Division Live. We hope everybody has a good rest of their day today. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.